American history has its sliding door moments. We would not be speaking American today but for the impact of one British atheist on the American Christian colonists following his arrival in the American colony in 1774. If one man was responsible for identifying the ideology behind the freedoms we now associate with the Constitution-led United States, then that man was Thomas Paine. Had Paine never arrived in the American colony, the violent armed insurrection against the oppressor leading to the drafting of a constitution enshrining freedoms for the newly liberated oppressed would not have occurred when it did. Above all other writers, it was the words of Thomas Paine that sparked the spirit that still burns today as the Constitution of the United States, a nation of government by the people, for the people, in which life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is a concept that originates from one individual. Rights of Man, 1791, is a book by Thomas Paine, born in England in 1737, who lived for 72 years until his death in the United States of America in 1809, then a sovereign nation. The United States that did not exist when Paine arrived in the American colony in 1774, aged 37, fleeing what was almost certainly going to be the death penalty by the British Kingdom for his seditious attack on the King's God-given right to kill at will for empire and personal wealth accumulation by the leader class, at that time known as the aristocracy. Paine's writings, both when in England and after arriving in the American colony, influenced the American Revolution and inspired the U.S. Declaration of Independence. The ideology of the United States, the parts most identified with what is noble about America and the Constitution, would not exist without Thomas Paine, who is, above all others, responsible for creating the constitutional representation of the freedoms that exist for Americans. So, it's worth looking back at how Thomas Paine was able to inspire a revolution for liberation from the tyranny of evil men who killed women and children for their Christian ideology to inspire a new sovereign country, the United States. Paine's influence in creating these United States starts with this book, published little more than 200 years ago. Paine's book posits that popular political revolution is permissible when a government does not safeguard the natural rights of its people. Government's sole purpose is safeguarding the individual and his or her inherent inalienable rights. Each societal institution that does not benefit the nation is illegitimate, especially monarchy and aristocracy. The book's acumen derives from the Age of Enlightenment. The values it espouses are universally accepted as inalienable human rights, the rights of man. Paine's Rights of Man was printed by a London publisher, Joseph Johnson, for publication on 21st February 1791, then withdrawn for fear of prosecution. J.S. Jordan stepped in and published it on the 16th of March. The 90,000-word book appeared on 13th March, 3 weeks later than scheduled. It sold as many as 1 million copies and was eagerly read by reformers, Protestant dissenters, Democrats, London craftsmen, and the skilled factory hands of the new industrial North. William Godwin, helping with the publishing of the book, declared that the seeds of revolution it contains are so vigorous in their stamina that nothing can overpower them. Human rights originate in nature, thus rights cannot be granted via political charter because that implies that rights are legally revocable, hence would be privileges. It is a perversion of terms to say that a charter gives rights. It operates by a contrary effect, that of taking rights away. Rights are inherently in all the inhabitants, but charters, by annulling those rights, in the majority, leave the right, by exclusion, in the hands of a few. They consequently are instruments of injustice. The fact, therefore, must be that the individuals themselves, each in his own personal and sovereign right, entered into a contract with each other to produce a government, and this is the only mode in which governments have a right to arise, and the only principle on which they have a right to exist. Rights of Man, London, 1795. Principally, Rights of Man opposes the idea of hereditary government, the belief that dictatorial government is necessary because of man's corrupt essential nature. The book was not so well received by the English royal family or by the British government. Paine was prosecuted under English law and would certainly have been jailed and probably executed for this radical belief if he had not fled persecution by the authority. Ideas that in today's legal climate would be declared terrorism and prosecuted under terrorist law. Paine left his home in Lewis for Philadelphia in 1774, intending to make a new life in the American colonies at the suggestion of Benjamin Franklin, who he had met in London. Once settled in the American colonies, Paine's words and actions inspired the revolution against the British, leading to the Constitution that led to the formation of these United States, with all that followed the historical moment that gave birth to a new nation. The United States exists because of an ideology that is enshrined in a constitution. Unfortunately, the racist religious right of conservative dominion by the rich, the Nazi forces this constitution was created to oppose, ultimately overcame this fine principled ideology. Is it worth being reminded of what the Constitution represents? A few key points at least, starting with poverty, the poor underclass. How should government treat the poor and illiterate? In the closing chapters of Rights of Man, Paine addresses the condition of the poor, outlining a detailed social welfare proposal predicated upon the redirection of government expenditures. From the onset, Paine asserts all citizens have an inherent claim to welfare. Man did not enter into society to become worse than he was before, nor to have fewer rights than he had before, but to have those rights better secured. Paine emphasizes the compatibility between individual rights and societal well-being. He understands that crippling poverty undermines the rights of an individual and consequently the legitimacy of government. Simply put, when 1% of the population control 90% of the wealth, then you know the intention of the Constitution has been corrupted. The government responsible for this fleecing of rights from the poorest is, at the very least, illegitimate. At the time of his writing, Paine observes England's population to be about 7 million people. He supposes around 1/5 of the population is poor, 20% then. In the US today, that number is 66%. The number of poor then, according to Paine's estimations, would total around 1.4 million people in need of support. Paine's remedy for financing such a large welfare endeavor would be to cut military expenditures of the state and redirect the funds towards the people of the state. Simply put, if any American was interested in claiming their rights under the Constitution, they would know that starts with a government who stops spending money on wars that benefit only the rich leader class, always and only at the expense of the poor. A government fit for purpose who spend the national wealth on uplifting the citizenry on an equal footing, including urgent remedy for the poorest. Paine argued that since the age of revolution rendered a new era of peace, the government no longer needed to devote so many resources towards monarchical wars. Instead, the surplus of tax revenue could be reintegrated back into society with the formation of a welfare program. He also estimates that near 4 million out of the 17 million in Britain's total tax revenues from customs and excise duties could be salvaged from the government's expenditure and redirected and redistributed to the people of the nation. It is by all accounts a pretty obvious notion for a society to grow by. Nazism, by contrast, is where the rich use brute force, fomenting wars to divert funds earned by slave labor via military contracts lining only their pockets, while not protecting the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness from the multitudes of poor that this governmental failure creates and fails to represent. There is a very obvious link between government spending on the poorest and education. On education, Paine sees the problem with corrupt government failing to provide education to the poorest. Education is a foundational cornerstone of Paine's welfare plan. Paine claims, a nation under a well-regulated government should permit none to remain uninstructed. Paine largely focuses on educating the youth population. He contends that educating children will ultimately compel the betterment of society holistically. Paine insists a proactive social welfare system that educates the country's youth will act as a preventative measure and engender greater knowledge amongst the population. He explains that poor children and young people are typically deprived of equal access to education. Poor children coming from poor families are often forced to seek apprenticeships and work, and are thus subsequently robbed of the ability to pursue education. Poverty then becomes cyclical in nature and undoubtedly increases with time. Lack of education amongst the young population will also lead to increased violence and crime. To combat this problem, Paine proposes government responsibly provide education for the poor on an equal footing with the rich. Successive American governments have done exactly the opposite of what the Constitution intends for the education of the populace. The dumbing down process by the leader class that finds us at this point today, where over 99% of American voters vote for Nazism, believing that is their only political choice. Keeping the rich leader class growing ever richer, while the dumbed down majority become ever poorer, watching their leaders spend their children's education on sending American landmines to kill civilians in 2024, long after landmines are known to be weapons suitable only for terrorism with no other strategic value. In November of 2024, Biden sent missiles to Russia, inviting a nuclear escalation, and he sent landmines for use against Russians. Trump's influence is even worse. For example, in 2016, he placed a Blackwater billionaire contractor's sister, Betsy DeVos, in charge of an educational model intended to remove education from the poorest, increasing the dumbing down of the worker class. Betsy DeVos, as an expert in education on a national scale, is, of course, a counterintuitive pick that cannot be confused with a leader representing the best interests of education for the next generation of American thinkers. As a result, an American education, when considered from the opportunities for a poor person, is not an education at all. This unfortunate generation of students learn only to parrot repeat a narrative that is written to stop them developing critical thought, the precise opposite of what an education should be. Deliberately creating a supplicant generation incapable of challenging the leader class right to absorb 100% of the national wealth for their personal benefit. Some 85% of juvenile offenders in the United States in 2023 cannot read and write to a third grade level. 100% of those are first, second, or third generation juvenile offenders. The poor are now even more disabled by lack of education than they were 100 years ago. For the poor American underclass, things get worse in direct proportion to the increased wealth for the 1% leader class. So much so that Biden can send expensive missiles to attack Russia, spending hundreds of billions on war rather than 1 cent on uplifting the education of the unfortunate 50% of Americans who cannot read to an 8th grade level. And this news is not news at all in a dumbed-down America that owes this debt in dumbness in no small part to the manipulation of the education system by a corrupt government that is unfit. The illiteracy figures that accompany the rise of the leader class rich follow an equal and opposite trajectory. The rich get considerably richer with every election of new leader class billionaires, while the poor become more illiterate and less capable of resistance to the tyranny that oppresses them. To the extent that, for example, you see them spend money they do not have buying overpriced Bibles from a criminal leader raising money to pay his hooker bills on a family values ticket. Paine's writing inspired the U.S. Declaration of Independence with many inalienable truths, including, "Any citizen of the world is welcome." How that migrated to the racist tyranny immigrants face in the current Nazi hijack of the democratic principles of the Constitution and all it represents is not difficult to explain in one sentence. Nazi ideologues motivated by greed and enabled by violent criminality have overpowered the rule of law protecting the government of the United States as constitutional representatives, replacing what once was government for the people by we the people with Nazi goons. "The world is my country, all mankind are my brethren," is another of the favorite sayings of this influential political philosopher, Thomas Paine. Initially, Paine chose the power of the pen over the sword, publishing his revolutionary ideology in words rather than advocating violence. He learned, as Nelson Mandela would learn 200 years later, that authoritarian leaders who rule by force do not surrender power any other way. On January 10, 1776, Paine published a pamphlet in the American colonies that ignited independence in America and shifted the political landscape of the Patriot movement from reform within the British imperial system to independence from it. It was called Common Sense. Around this time, the horse and carriage traffic that used the left side for travel, like Britain, moved to the other side of the road. 120,000 copies sold in the first 3 months in a nation of 3 million people, making Common Sense the best-selling printed work by a single author in American history up to that time. Paine's simplified retelling of his ideology explained in short sentences that resonated with the lowest common denominator. British rule was exploitative and detrimental to colonial society, and that the 1770s crisis could only be resolved by colonial independence. That goal could only be achieved through unified action. That action would have to be violent. Freedom from tyranny never comes without a price. Power only comes from being taken. Fomenting revolution for his new American friends, Paine mocked British Christian royal supremacy in America, provoking the "for God, King and Country" supplicants with lines like, "Even brutes do not devour their young, nor savages make war upon their own families." Paine took a dim view of the British royal government killing children in their standard practice for controlling the empire, believing this alone made them unfit to govern. Finally, in his storytelling, Paine detailed in the most graphic, compelling, and recognizable terms the suffering that the colonies had endured, reminding his readers of the torment and trauma that British policy had inflicted upon them. Mass child murder by the Nazi-style British colonists made compelling reading when written by the wordsmith Paine. Common sense resonated with the colonists' firm belief in liberty and determined opposition to injustice. As historian Scott Leal argues in Thomas Paine, Common Sense and the Turning Point to Independence. By including all of the colonists in the discussion that would determine their future, common sense became not just a critical step in the journey toward American independence, but also an important artifact in the foundation of American democracy. The Revolutionary War began in 1775 as an insurrection by patriots in the 13 colonies against British rule, resulting in American independence. Shortly after which, Paine's Common Sense book gave purpose and direction to the belligerents. In March of 1780, the Assembly passed an abolition act that freed 6,000 enslaved people, to which Paine wrote the preamble. This happened 80 years before the Civil War with the South for abolition. In 1783, Paine enlisted and met General George Washington, whom Paine served under. The war for independence was long and brutal. The colonists may well have been defeated by the superior strength of the British, but for the intervention of the French. After some 8 years of bloody battle, on September 3, 1783, Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States in the Treaty of Paris. 5 years later came the Constitution of the United States. The supreme law of the United States superseded the Provisional Articles of Confederation, the nation's first constitution, on March 4, 1789. Originally including 7 articles, the Constitution delineates the frame of the federal government. The Constitution's first 3 articles embody the doctrine of the separation of powers, in which the federal government is divided into 3 branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. The Constitution of the United States is the oldest and longest-standing written and codified national constitution in force in the world. The Constitution plainly does not limit American citizens to a government of "we the Zionist genocidal Nazis, for you the 99% dumbed-down accomplices to genocide." Thomas Paine saw injustice of this kind, the mass murder of babies by the state, in what was common practice by the brutal British attack forces harvesting wealth for the exclusive benefit of the leader class, as a bad thing. Paine's motivation in writing was not to sell books and make money. It was to liberate people from this practice by corrupt government, whether they were appointed by God, as they claimed, or not. He achieved this by educating the reader into making up their own mind on what was right and what was not. Paine used words to motivate people to take action. His words started a revolution with a noble goal. Many people died to win the freedoms enshrined in the Constitution he inspired. Then, in 2024, 99% of Americans who voted were so dumbed down by the decades of dumbing down by their irredeemably corrupt leader class, they voted for an end to the law that gave them the freedom to have a meaningful vote. It is remarkable to think what might have been if, in 1774, a thoughtful, intelligent British writer was not persuaded to move to America by Benjamin Franklin. Had Paine not immigrated to the unknown and gifted the world his wisdom for free, then Zionists would never have had the opportunity to corrupt the institution that is the American government, now flawed beyond repair by the ironclad commitment to baby murder and the mass genocidal starvation of millions for a small handful of lying Zionists to accumulate obscene wealth, while the majority, above 50%, remain mired in squalid, illiterate, generational poverty. That religion lies at the confluence of America's polarized sides, the Nazis and the anti-Nazis, was a feature in Paine's own life, whereas atheism made him a constant target for the church. On his deathbed, His doctor asked him if he wished to accept Jesus Christ before passing. "I have no wish to believe on that subject," Paine replied before taking his final breath. We find ourselves at this time in what can only be seen as a mess. 2 seconds to midnight on the doomsday clock. Genocide is messy. Starving 2 million people to death and blowing up an entire nation, dropping more bombs than every war put together, is best seen in the context that we are dropping huge Biden bunker buster bombs on civilians in tents. The vast majority of the dead are women and children, exactly as God-fearing Americans believe voting for is the right thing to do. What will happen next? It was all too easy for the Zionist leader class to get 99% of American voters to vote Nazi genocide for their personal enrichment. My guess is it will be impossible to vote them out. Perhaps now is a good time to reflect on the history of democracy and Nazism. America's democracy in 1789 had everything you could wish for in a constitution. That it has been corrupted is unarguable. Corrupted in every way that we understand corruption of an ideology to include. If it can be revised and reinstalled as Constitutional Democracy version 2 that works for all the same reasons the Constitution created the most successful democracy in history, will become apparent. While Nazis run not just the United States government, but all Western governments that wield global power, it is difficult to see where the strength to overcome their death grip on the levers of power will come from. But come from somewhere it must, before this Netanyahu-led Greater Israel nukes the planet. For this change to begin, a return to constitutional law and the values that define the United States, justice must follow. Starting with the leader class and extending to the rank and file. Biden leaves a legacy few leaders in history can lay claim to, not Hitler, not Stalin, definitely not Mao Zedong. A geriatric leader who still openly boasts about his lifelong commitment to Nazism. Biden began this premeditated genocide with his propagandized lie about 40 beheaded babies, and similar tropes of indoctrination genocide leaders apply on a dumbed-down majority to encourage that orgy of mass murder that is also known as genocide. Biden has only ever lied to the electorate, placing Zionist allegiance over all other legal or moral considerations, while obstructing international justice, impeding the flow of aid to the besieged that he paid to besiege and bomb in tents, cheerfully sending billions in tools for genocide, even as premature babies in incubators were dying in the hospitals Biden's administration agreed should be bombed, while vigorously defending his right to stand down the international agencies established at Nuremberg to prevent exactly the kind of leadership atrocity Biden has been committing daily for many years now. Worse still is the number who is so deceived by the American model of democracy, the two-party system of proportional representation in which less than 2.5% of the US are Jewish, and yet 99% of the government representatives are committed Zionists. Zionists with such a hold over the US electorate, they successfully won over 99% of the vote, entitling the genocide to continue without any admission of wrongdoing, without any accountability to Thomas Paine and all his fellows who worked so tirelessly and fought so long and hard to win the freedoms assured by the Constitution, without any accountability to international law, in which 99% of American voters chose to vote for their entitlement to share in the proceeds arising from criminal mass murder above their right to have the proportional democracy the Constitution promised. Nuremberg is how the last team of Nazis who committed the identical crimes to this Zionist batch were prosecuted, setting precedent in international law, the Nuremberg Protocols. There is no doubt that the US government representatives, in the vast majority motivated by their rewarding association with Zionism, are guilty beyond any reasonable doubt of a criminality that warrants multiple life terms for all, if we are to return to a rule of law in line with the intention of the Constitution. The same people who write "finish them" on 2,000-pound bombs aimed at children in tents, who give standing ovations to Netanyahu in the US Congress when he asks for more billions to commit more mass murder. With the inspiration of Thomas Paine's ideology to foment the American Revolution, Americans defeated the forces of Christian fascist tyranny who killed children. They weren't called Nazis then, or even fascist. These ideological distinctions came later, but Nazi fascists they were then, Nazi fascists they are now. Why did 99% of American voters choose Nazi fascism? The answer, in my opinion, is in my book. For more history of democracy, government and stuff, read my book. Half the story has never been told.